This hour, hour 4 here, we will be focusing on restorative justice and questions regarding the dignity of the human person as it relates to prison ministry. And as I did with the hour, well, I guess 2 hours ago, I'd like again to begin with a little bit of Lectio. And this time I will be pulling here from the Gospel of John, chapter 11. And this is the raising of Lazarus story. We're not going to do, obviously, the whole chapter or even most of the passage, but I thought I would kind of bring us to what is to me, it's a very interesting insight into how Christ ministers and brings life. And I think in a way how he also, by showing us as a model, as an example, invites us to do the same. And so this is the Gospel of John chapter 11. And at this point already, Mary and Martha have reported the news of Lazarus' death. Lazarus has already died, and Jesus has showed up here at the tomb of Lazarus. So beginning in verse 32 of John chapter 11. So Mary, when she arrived where Jesus was and saw him, fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, had you been here, my brother would not have died." Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, he groaned in his spirit and yielded himself to his turmoil and said, "Where have you laid him?" They say to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. So the Judeans said, "See how he cherished him?" But some of them said, "Is not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man able to bring it about that this man also might not die?" So Jesus, again groaning within himself, comes to the tomb, and it was a cavern, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus says, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the man who had died, says to him, "Lord, by now it gives off a bad odor, for this is the 4th day." Jesus says to her, "Have I not told you that if you have faith, you will see God's glory?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "I give you thanks that you have heard me, and I knew that you always hear me. But I have spoken on account of the crowd standing all around, so that they might have faith that you have sent me." In saying these words, he cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." The one who had died came forth, feet and hands bound with strips of linen, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus says to them, "Unbind him and let him go." So this reading coming from the Gospel of John, I believe we see some very powerful moments in the ministry of Jesus and how Jesus chooses in this situation to minister. The first point that I think is really key is this translation, this unique translation by David Bentley Hart, translates this passage, I think, wonderfully when he translates it, quote, "When Jesus saw her weeping, he groaned in his spirit and yielded himself to his turmoil." In this way, Jesus, recognizing the sorrow of the sister of Lazarus, in her grief. I think this is the empathy that Father George was speaking about, that there's a shared sense of an understanding of being able to, in some way, associate or find access to the profound feelings of grief that she herself is experiencing. That Jesus is not aloof, but rather is aware of the degree of grief and turmoil, and in many ways, her sorrow becomes his sorrow. I think that, in ministry, in any situation, I think, as Father George was saying in the last hour, for us to be aware of our feelings and of our own feelings at times of perhaps grief or sadness when seeing someone else experiencing grief or sadness can be very effective. Again, if we're conscious and aware of how we are processing these feelings in certain situations. But I think even more so, and certainly given the context in which I'm bringing this passage to allow it to speak regarding the dignity of the human person, is that Christ takes serious the feelings of human beings. And her sorrow becomes his sorrow. And there is a shared kind of sorrowfulness in this passage that is powerful. But we will see then, in a way, how it leads to intercessory prayer for Christ. So one of the next, I think, key kind of moments in this passage is when they, Mary and Martha, say to the Lord, "Come and see." It's interesting because throughout the Gospel of John, it is, up to this point, it's usually Christ saying to the disciples, "Come and see." But in this passage, it is Mary and Martha, it's the mere mortals that are inviting God to come and witness what is utterly human: loss, mortality, grieving, bereavement, and all of the sorrows. So this is this moment in which these human beings, Mary and Martha, are inviting now Jesus to come and see, to come and witness. And so he does, as so many in our ministries, I may not always succeed, but to keep in mind of the powerful vulnerability that so many of those that I minister to are expressing when they invite me in a little bit just into their history, into their experiences. They invite us to come and see and to witness their grief and their sadness and perhaps their guilt, their shame, their humiliation. It's hard to think of a more humiliating place to be than to be in shackles and to be imprisoned. So God descends. Christ descends into the cavern of where Lazarus is buried. And then finally, the last little bit here that I'd like to share in this passage is the prayer that emerges out of this experience. To me, it's always struck me. I shouldn't say always, but it's recently struck me as a uniquely, also kind of vulnerable moment, and as far as Christ's prayers, it's the gratitude for God's presence in the midst of, again, Jesus having wept, the uncertainty of all that has happened. Jesus says, he prays, lifting his eyes, saying, "I give you thanks that you have heard me." That sense of trust, of knowing that God is a God who hears the prayers of his people. And then he says, "And I knew that you always hear me." That confidence in God's presence, that God is a good Father. I've in my ministry, I've found myself, since going into the prisons, referring more and more to God as a good father. There is something about when we in experiences in ministry, for me, interestingly enough, ministry to the incarcerated has deepened my awareness of the goodness of God and the faithfulness of God and the generosity of God. And this prayer that Jesus offers up is a prayer of this confidence, almost kind of a childlike sense and trust that God the Father has heard his prayers and sent him into this. I say all of that to say finally that acts of injustices or acts of deprivation of human contact, of extraordinary loneliness that we experience in being in prisons and ministry of presence, hopefully doesn't simply end there with ministry of presence, but can also, if possible, open ourselves to new realities of prayer, of praying for those whom we have encountered, entrusting their lives into the care of the good Father. Oftentimes when I leave the prisons, and having heard excruciating stories of violence and of neglect and of abuse, and then leaving them in their cells, you feel very helpless, thinking, how is this ever going to be remedied? And I often can only offer up a prayer that God, the good Father, is not indifferent, but rather is aware of the needs of each person that I minister to. And so there are these ways in which I believe that the disclosure that happens in moments of ministry are disclosures that happen not only for us to witness, but that kind of through us, God is witnessing. That God is witnessing Chadwick's or Sedgwick's or Tavares's or Michael's own pain and deprivation. So there's a story for me that happened very early on in my own in my prison ministry again in North Florida at Florida State Prison, which is not only where they house death row, but also has an enormous solitary confinement camp, roughly about 1,000 men that are in as is best described to me. Was actually by a correctional officer who described working in solitary confinement. When friends asked him, what is it like to work in solitary confinement? He said, pretty much think of it as in this way, that it's like spending 12 hours in a bathroom at a truck stop. That's more or less what it's like to live or to work in a solitary confinement in North Florida, at least. It's something awful and frankly very evil. But I was kind of early on in my visits, one day I was walking over to the P dorm, which is where death row is. And as I was walking, I'm walking by what looked like kind of dog kennel cages. And although more or less kind of about 7 feet in height, and there are these men that are in these cages, and this is where they will spend their 1 hour of outside time. It can be once a week or once every 2 or 3 weeks. So they get about an hour in these cages. And as I was walking by, I heard someone, this was before I was a seminarian at the time, call out to me, hey, Mr. Dustin. And I looked over and I saw this young African-American man, and I'm usually really awful with names, especially on the spot. But in that moment, I immediately remembered his name, even though we had had one conversation the week before. And I called out to him. I said, "Hey, Michael, how are you?" And Michael stood there, stunned, and just looked at me, kind of with his shoulders dropped, and he said, "You remembered my name." And it was that moment that I realized just how dehumanizing the prison system has become, certainly in the state that I serve at, that Michael would be shocked that another person would remember, not only remember him, but would remember his name. And to me, that kind of really brought to home the reality of what is at stake in this ministry more often than not, perhaps more so in certain regions of the country, is the dignity of the human person. That dignity, the dignity of the human person is oftentimes what we have most to try to recover. And again, I think we do it in all of the ways that what we've been discussing, Father George and I, through empathy, through listening, through respecting, through entering into relationship, and hopefully establishing some degrees of trust. In Gaudium et Spes, document of the Second Vatican Council, we read this: God did not create man as a solitary, for from the beginning he created them male and female. Their companionship produces the primary form of interpersonal communion. For by his innermost nature, man is a social being. And unless he relates himself to others, he can neither live nor develop his potential. End quote. Obviously, the context here is, I think, kind of multifaceted. Certainly, the document is speaking about marriage, the institution of marriage, and the human family. But I think it's also stating in a way that we've heard it in different instances of the fundamental reality that human beings are not created atomistically, individually, as an island unto themselves, but are rather created for others. And as this document in just this one sentence says, for by his innermost nature, man is a social being, and unless he relates himself to others, he can neither live nor develop his potential. We know that we live and we grow and we thrive in community, in relationships, in authentic relationships, but most especially in relationships where there is established trust, where there are the established boundaries that was mentioned before. And I believe that every time we come into prisons, we are, if done well, if done relationally, but again with boundaries, not seeking to fulfill our own needs, but the needs of those that we're serving, we are reminding and recovering that innate dignity that every human person is created for others and for a relationship. And fortunately, even if when you go to the prisons, if you're primarily doing it in the context of Mass, there's so many ways, right? Extending the hand of peace. There are so many ways in which we kind of reaffirm that fundamental reality of the social nature of the human person. And yet, when you go into the prisons, not only do you experience and see the deprivation of a social existence that so many of these individuals live currently in, but I venture to say that you also encounter in their lives, you encounter a history of a kind of a deprivation of society, of meaningful social and familial and communal lives that predates their time of incarceration. So many of the men that I serve have essentially lived in a kind of incarcerated culture, prison culture from the very beginnings, and have rarely had access to some of the basic things that we take for granted. Pope Francis speaks of this I believe this comes from a homily that he gave when he visited the United States, and he spoke in New York. Pope Francis said, "Today everything comes under the laws of competition and the survival of the fittest, where the powerful feed upon the powerless. And as a consequence, masses of people find themselves excluded and marginalized, without work, without possibilities, without any means of escape. As Francis calls it, we are in a time when we need to undergo a conversion towards the peripheries of existence. This is something that we've heard him reference often. In my experience, prisons you find these peripheries at every cell of existence. And for us, in our theology, in our liturgy, in our prayers, we are providing, I hope, a refuge and a means of escape from a culture and a society that has marginalized them. As we know, finally, regarding the question of the human dignity of the person, we believe that every human person transcends the worst things that they have done. That every single human person is greater, is more than the worst decisions that they have made. I know for myself, I hope and I believe that is the case. I can't imagine if my life was determined and judged by the worst thing that I have done, and that it was through that lens that every human person saw me. This, I think, perhaps more so than any, there's so many other things that are going on that are a threat to human dignity, but perhaps it is this aspect of our criminal justice system that reduces the human person to an isolated moment, a single moment, an act in their lives, and judges them in that light. For us as a church grounded, formed, founded upon mercy, it is our opportunity to remind each person that we serve in the prisons of that their dignity is created and given to them by God the Father, and that no human institution, no penal system can take that away, and that they are more than the worst decisions that they have made. As we explore just a little bit more, I'm going to just say a word about Catholic social teaching regarding this, and then I would like to talk a little bit about, in my own experiences, how Catholic social teachings have helped form how I view this work and this mission, with looking at one particular issue that we face in today's prisons. Similarly, in the document that I quoted earlier from the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes, talks again this kind of increasing awareness of interpersonal relationships, and that interpersonal relationships are a key in securing the dignity of the human person. And in those interpersonal relationships, we have ways in which we come to not only affirm their dignity, but to provide them a kind of a means in which to do it, and or to experience it. And I think that this, to me, is the greatest contribution of Catholic social teaching, as was mentioned by Sister at the beginning in introducing in my introduction. That I'm a convert. I came into the church in 2007, and prior to that was raised in a wonderfully devout Methodist home background, loving family, a lot of great experiences. As I like to say, I met Jesus in the Methodist Church, and then have kind of discovered his community, his church, in coming into communion with the church, in Catholicism. But in my kind of period of discerning and thinking about whether or not to become Catholic, it was the moral teachings, the social teachings of the church that really spoke to me the most, both from the writings from Pope John Paul II, and then Pope Benedict XVI, and as I was reading these teachings, I realized that the fullness of the church is in how we express this faith in the world. That is to say, that the fruit of our spirituality, the fruit of our conversion, the fruit of our encounters with Christ, is how we work for justice and mercy in our communities and in the world around us. That the teachings of the faith, the creed that we speak, is known in how we treat one another. And in those readings, becoming more and more aware of not only of the dignity of the human person, but the way in which each person is created to participate in the common good of society. So prisons then, again, necessarily, almost tragically, become a place in where we see the ills of our society. As I think it was Dostoevsky who said that you can judge a civilization by how it treats its prisoners. That we judge a civilization is only civilized to an extent to the way in which and how it treats its prisoners. And God have mercy if that is in fact the case with our current system. Now I would just like to say finally here some words from my own experiences in the Deep South and ministry in prisons in North Florida. There are, again, multiple things that I feel like I've confronted and seen in my own ministry in prisons, but perhaps none more than the extent in which there are degrees of racism. The extent to which prisons are filled with people of color. It was very self-evident from the very beginning in just seeing the faces of the men that I was serving in prison in Florida. And then over time, I've realized that I'm not the only one, and that others have recognized it as well. In fact, even our church and many leaders in our church. As a Catholic priest, I serve in the Panhandle of Florida, and I've had privilege to see up close the realities inside these prisons. As a minister, I am allowed to go into places in this maximum security prison where really no outsiders are allowed, not even really attorneys, aside from correctional officers and mental health and nurses and such. This is it's almost, at times you feel a sense of the responsibility that I have in being able to have access into some of these spaces. Visitors rarely see beyond the visitation room near the entrances to the facility. But just past the well-manicured lawns out front and the gleaming razor wire fences, beyond that you begin to experiencing the sweltering dorms where over 1,000 men are warehoused in solitary confinement in just one prison. This is one prison in particular that I'm speaking of. There are a handful of other solitary confinement camps. It is here that I became most aware that I am occupying what Pope Francis regards as the peripheries tucked away in Northwest Florida. In the steel and concrete hallways lined with steel cells filled with men sweltering in the summer heat, oftentimes more often idle and bored. This is why I should have mentioned it earlier regarding the use of the imagination, why I think the imagination is so key and so crucial in our ministries and prisons, is because in my experience, so many of the men suffer not only from loneliness, but from boredom, from sheer and utter boredom, because, and at least in my state, there are so few access to programs and educational courses. Moving slowly along these hallways, sweating and uncomfortable in the stench and the constant noise, cell to cell, I've witnessed countless blank stares of hopelessness and defeat, and that's not an exaggeration. Within these cells, each no larger than most of our bathrooms, I see predominantly black faces, revealing the grim reality that grave racial injustices are occurring in our cities day after day as more poor, young black men are taken from their already violent communities and sent off to prisons. It has been my practice and practice of others that I know that engage in some of this ministry to stop at each of these kind of scratched plexiglass windows to inquire into the individual's lives, his hopes, his desires for a future. Many of them have no working concept of what it would mean to get an education. This will get to the question of re-entry. They've never thought about a career. Most of the men that I serve have never had a bank account. Many of them have never had a driver's license. The Department of Corrections has told me that about where I serve, about 75% of the men have an education level up to about 6th grade. These are the throwaways that Pope Francis speaks of. This is them. The United States has the highest prison population in the world. We are about 4.5% of the world's population, and yet we house roughly about 22% of the world's prisoners. This gets to the question of the moral teachings of the church and the way in which we see elements of injustices within the prison system. Much of this is due to our severe length of prison sentences. And as I have encountered, especially in the South, we see there is an extraordinary amount of individuals that have life sentences for even non-homicides. Louisiana was at one point the prison capital of the world per capita, but with Mississippi, Georgia, Oklahoma, and Florida not far behind. You actually have to go pretty far down the list of how many prisoners there are per capita till we actually find other countries that are rivaling states. Countries that first appear are Cuba, Rwanda, Russia. Louisiana locks up five times as many people as Iran, and 13 times more people than communist China. But it is the issue for me in my experiences of the disproportionality among ethnicity that is the most staggering. Whites make up about 64% of our population and 39% of our prison population. Blacks are 13% of our U.S. population, but about 40% of our prison population. There are more African American men in prison than total prison populations in India, England, Israel, Argentina, Canada, Lebanon, Japan, Germany, and Finland combined. My work, and I know so many of the works of those that are in prison ministry, feel compelled to accompany those that they serve. It is through accompaniment that we become deeply acquainted not only with our history, but the history of those that we serve. As has been mentioned in different contexts through different individuals, and I'm a big believer in this, that prison ministry and going into the prisons, you oftentimes find yourself being evangelized. And what I mean by that is hearing their stories, experiencing degrees of their own isolation, you find all the more the need for the gospel and the need for that transcendent sense of hope to be able to share. For me, it is in this context that I believe all the more that it is the preaching of the gospel, and not in terms of proselytizing, but rather it is in sharing of the hope in a God who is good that is most vital. And this is why oftentimes, even with men from various different backgrounds and different religious traditions, when they ask me to pray, they respond most palpably to the sense of God as a good father, and that notion of goodness and of presence that comes again and again and again. It is these healing realities that we experience when we address the needs of the dignity of the human person. And so finally, as in thinking of all of this, to me, this raises the questions we've raised questions regarding the dignity of the human person, how we can restore the dignity of the human person through a relationally oriented ministry, and then also seeing the way in which the church in her teachings gives us a wonderful kind of gives us the instruments, not only to diagnose the larger societal issues that are being raised, but also provides us with a prophetic opportunity to share the experiences that we experience in our ministries with so many of our sisters and brothers and the faithful in the parishes. So that's kind of where I would like to end with this, is just to say that the benefits of any ministry, again, going back, it could be going and visiting the sick, it could be going into homeless shelters. In this context, it is going into prisons. The church, parishes, Bible studies, different associations, gives us the forum to report back in a way and to bring our experiences into the larger body of Christ, to share. Because then it is only through that the church, I think, can be fully mobilized to address what is an issue not only of relationships, but as Father George mentioned at the beginning, it's systemic. We're dealing with systems. And the church, as a prophetic witness, isn't going to be able to solve and fix the situation, but it can at least bring it to bear, and to kind of an awareness, and to kind of a wider kind of consciousness. The story of, again, going back to Archbishop Oscar Romero in his work in El Salvador, I was struck when I read about the fact that he set up a human rights commission within his archdiocese. He had attorneys and reporters and others documenting human rights abuses, and so as to have those stories be brought into the churches so that the church could become more aware of the plight of their sisters and brothers. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that is something that is necessarily fitting for every diocese, but what I am saying is that when we are faced with injustices, and obviously we have to be careful with becoming advocates in prisons, because we're granted privileged access. I can at any moment be asked to leave the facility. I am there because they have opened their doors to me and to be able to serve. But at the same time, I think it is unfair to expect people to witness in your ministries, to witness such deprivation and such injustices, and not to have a space, a community in which to share those experiences. So to me, that brings back what Father George mentioned earlier, is the importance in this ministry of not being a lone ranger. The importance of not only having a spiritual director, but a community of people that you're able to bring your experiences, the stories of Quandarius and of Quentin and of so many others, into a community setting where you can share the experiences that you are experiencing. And hopefully as a way to raise the larger issues that the church faces in this type of ministry. The ministry of presence brings hopefully to light the aspects of injustices that we experience routinely. And so with that, finally, this is when we call upon the God of the living, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but the God who raised Lazarus to dead, or raised Lazarus to life from the dead. I oftentimes think that in the time of the age, perhaps some people would have thought, why would you bring Lazarus back into the world? If he died, and he died a just man, why not let him be in peace, right? For all immortality, for eternal life. Why did Jesus bring him back to life? There are a lot of different theological answers, I'm sure. But the final point here for me is that Jesus, I believe, brought Lazarus back to life because that is an innate expression of our human dignity, that we are created for others. We are created for human communities. We are created to live and to thrive. And to me, that was a radical affirmation of Jesus saying that this world, these communities are created for goodness and something for us to all share in.